Homelander had faced gods, monsters, and mobs, but never silence. When Lady Death arrived, the sky didn't split open with lightning. Buildings didn't crumble into ash. The crowds didn't scream in terror, as they so often did when disaster struck. Instead, something far more terrifying happened. The world simply stopped pretending. For the first time in the boys' universe's blood-soaked history, every camera, every spotlight, every manufactured moment of heroic glory froze. Not because of an attack, not because of some cosmic invasion, but because something ancient and inevitable had finally turned its attention toward a world that had spent decades running from the one truth no amount of Compound 5 could ever escape. Death had arrived, and she wasn't here to negotiate. The first sign wasn't carnage, it was stillness. Across every major city, from New York to Los Angeles, a strange calm settled over terminal wards and hospitals. Patients who had been screaming hours ago went quiet. Not peaceful, not drugged, just ready. Nurses noticed it first, the way dying eyes stopped fighting and simply accepted. One elderly woman in Manhattan looked past her family toward the corner of her room and smiled. She whispered a name no one else could hear. Then she was gone. Security footage from that hospital would later show something impossible. For exactly 3 seconds before she died, a figure stood in the corner. Tall, pale, patient. The cameras glitched, pixelating reality itself, but the outline remained. Lady Death had been there, watching, waiting, claiming what had always been hers. If you want to witness more tales where gods meet their reckoning and universes face truths they've denied for too long, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, mortality, and whether the villains in this story were ever the ones we thought they were. This is going to shatter the boys' universe from the inside out, and you won't want to miss a single moment of the collapse. Now let's continue into the nightmare. Vought International's monitoring systems detected the anomaly within hours, but they didn't understand what they were seeing. Their satellites showed nothing. Their cameras captured only glitches and static, yet the data was undeniable. Death rates globally had spiked exactly 0.0%, but the nature of those deaths had fundamentally changed. People weren't dying from their injuries anymore. They were dying because their time had come. Compound V test subjects who should have survived catastrophic trauma simply stopped. Their hearts quit, their regeneration failed, and in the final moments before each death, security teams reported the same impossible detail. The subjects weren't afraid. They looked relieved, as if something or someone had finally released them from a burden they'd carried far too long. The boys' universe had built its entire existence on a lie. That death could be bought, sold, delayed, or defeated entirely. Vought had manufactured gods from test tubes, heroes from PR campaigns, and immortality from Compound 5 injections. They'd convinced the world that mortality was negotiable, that with enough money, enough power, enough celebrity, you could escape the one certainty that had governed humanity since the beginning of time. They'd created a universe where physics bent to corporate will, where biology bowed to branding, where even death itself seemed to respect the bottom line. But Lady Death had never signed a contract with Vought. She'd never agreed to their terms, and she'd certainly never cared about their shareholders. She walked through Times Square at midnight, and no one saw her. Not because she was invisible. She simply existed in a frequency the living weren't meant to perceive until their moment arrived. But those close to the edge, those teetering on life's final precipice, they saw her clearly. A homeless veteran dying of exposure looked up from his cardboard bed and met her eyes. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He just nodded, as if thanking an old friend for finally keeping her promise. Lady Death knelt beside him, and witnesses later reported the temperature dropped 15 degrees in a perfect circle around his body. When she stood, the veteran was gone. Peaceful. Free. The first truly honest death New York had seen in years. Across the city, Homelander stood on Vought Tower's observation deck, staring at data he refused to believe. His reflection in the glass showed a god. Perfect hair, perfect jaw, perfect symbol of American power emblazoned across his chest. But the reports streaming across his tablet showed something else entirely. Compound V test subjects failing across 12 facilities. Regeneration rates dropping without explanation. And that word, that impossible, insulting word, appearing in every single medical report. Natural causes. Homelander's jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. He'd built an empire on being stronger than death, faster than fate, more powerful than any force nature could conjure. The idea that something could invalidate him without even acknowledging his existence made his blood boil with rage he couldn't laser vision away. What Homelander didn't know, what Vought couldn't possibly comprehend, was that Lady Death wasn't an invader. She wasn't a villain to be defeated or a threat to be eliminated. She was a constant. The same force that had claimed every king, every conqueror, every self-proclaimed god throughout human history. She'd watched civilizations rise and fall. She'd seen empires crumble and species go extinct. And she'd learned one fundamental truth that the boys' universe had forgotten in its worship of manufactured divinity. Power doesn't make you immortal. It just makes you louder while you're alive. And when the noise finally stops, death comes for you exactly the same way it comes for everyone else. Without fanfare. Without negotiation. With absolute, undeniable certainty. The night Lady Death truly arrived in the boys' universe, she didn't announce herself with cosmic spectacle or dimensional portals. She simply stood in the one place no soup had ever dared to look, the mirror reflecting their own mortality. And for the first time since Compound 5 had flooded veins across America, the world's manufactured gods felt something they'd forgotten was even possible. They felt the cold breath of inevitability on the back of their necks. They felt their hearts beat a little faster, their hands shake just slightly. They felt, for one crystalline moment of absolute clarity, exactly what every human being they'd ever called weak had felt since the dawn of time. They felt afraid, because Lady Death hadn't come to fight them. She'd come to remind them of the one truth no amount of power could ever change. Everyone dies, even gods, especially gods. The emergency meeting in Vought Tower's executive boardroom lasted exactly 11 minutes before the first person died. Ashley Barrett had been mid-sentence, spinning her usual corporate damage control about isolated incidents and temporary anomalies, when Marcus Chen, head of Compound V development, clutched his chest and collapsed. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical flair Vought had trained everyone to expect from death. He simply stopped existing as a living thing. The paramedics arrived within 90 seconds. This was Vought Tower, after all, where even medical emergencies received 5-star treatment. But their equipment showed something that made seasoned EMTs go pale. Marcus had been dead before he hit the floor. Heart failure. Instant. Complete. And according to the monitors, impossible. He was 42 years old, peak physical condition, regular compound Phi microdoses to ensure enhanced longevity. He should have lived another 60 years minimum. Lady Death had other plans. Ashley Scruggs aimed at the medical team to try again, to use the experimental revival serum, to do literally anything except that a Vought executive had died in Vought Tower during a meeting about people dying. But the defibrillator pads wouldn't even charge. The equipment simply refused to fight what had already been decided. One of the paramedics, an older woman who'd seen too much death to fear it anymore, looked up at Ashley with exhausted eyes and said something that would haunt every recording of that meeting. "Ma'am, he's been gone for hours. His body just didn't know it yet." The timestamp on the security footage confirmed it. Marcus had been walking dead since 3:47 a.m., exactly when Lady Death had first been spotted in Manhattan. She'd marked him then, claimed him in that moment. The hours between had just been borrowed time he'd never actually owned. Vought's response was predictable. Deny everything, control the narrative, and throw money at the problem until it became someone else's crisis. Within an hour, every major news network received carefully crafted statements about unrelated medical emergencies and ongoing investigations into environmental factors. The Deep was dispatched to do a sympathetic interview about health awareness. A-Train filmed a PSA about heart disease prevention. Homelander himself appeared on conservative news networks to reassure Americans that their heroes were stronger than ever, that nothing and no one could threaten the security Vought provided. But behind the cameras, behind the smiles and the scripted confidence, every soup in America felt the same creeping dread. Their healing wasn't working quite right. Cuts that should have closed in seconds took minutes. Bruises that should have faded stayed purple and ugly for hours. They were becoming mortal. Slowly, inevitably, terrifyingly. The science team locked themselves in Vaught's deepest laboratory, running test after test on fresh compound V samples. Dr. Sarah Mehta had been synthesizing V for 15 years and had never seen results like this. The compound itself was chemically identical. Same molecular structure, same potency, same theoretical effectiveness. But when injected into test subjects, something fundamental had changed. The V still bonded with human tissue. It still granted powers, still enhanced abilities, but it no longer granted the one thing Vought had always promised as its greatest gift: defiance of death. Subject after subject showed the same results. Enhanced strength, yes. Accelerated healing, yes. But mortality? Still absolutely guaranteed. One test rabbit with V-enhanced regeneration was shot as part of standard protocols. It healed the wound. Then it died anyway 3 hours later. No explanation, no secondary cause, just death, arriving exactly when it was supposed to. V-enhancement be damned. A-Train was the first major soup to truly understand what was happening, and it destroyed him in ways his heart condition never could. He'd spent years running from consequences, from responsibility, from the faces of everyone his recklessness had killed. His speed had been his escape, his redemption, his proof that he mattered in a world that kept trying to replace him. But now, standing in his apartment at 4 a.m., staring at his hands, he felt something he'd never felt before. Slowness. Not physical slowness. He could still move faster than sound if he wanted, but temporal slowness. The crushing awareness that every heartbeat was counting down to something inevitable. He'd killed Robin by accident, killed countless others through negligence, and had always told himself he'd have time to make it right someday. Now, for the first time in his supercharged life, A-Train realized someday they had a deadline, and Lady Death was the one holding the calendar. She appeared to him that night, though he wouldn't tell anyone until much later. A-Train had been running, burning off the anxiety in laps around the city when he saw her standing in the middle of an empty highway. He couldn't stop in time. His momentum alone should have either passed through her or sent her flying. Instead, he stopped. Instantly. Perfectly. Without friction or gradual deceleration. One moment he was moving at Mach 2. The next he stood face to face with death itself. She didn't speak. Didn't threaten, didn't even acknowledge his powers as relevant to their encounter. She simply looked at him with eyes that had witnessed the end of stars, the collapse of galaxies, the final breath of universes, and in that gaze, A-Train saw every person he'd killed, not as victims, as appointments he'd made on her behalf, as lives he'd delivered to her door without ever understanding the weight of that delivery. Lady Death reached out one pale hand and touched his chest, directly over his damaged heart. Then she walked past him, continuing down the highway toward destinations only she could see. A-Train collapsed to his knees, gasping, alive but fundamentally changed. He'd been spared. For now. But the message was clear. She knew his name. She knew his debts. And eventually, she'd collect. Across the country, similar encounters began multiplying. Soups who'd thought themselves invincible found themselves face to face with their own mortality in ways no villain had ever achieved. Starlight woke up to find Lady Death sitting at the foot of her bed, reading through what looked like an ancient ledger. The pages showed names, thousands of them, and Starlight recognized them as every person who died in conflicts involving the Seven. Direct kills and collateral damage, all carefully recorded. Lady Death didn't speak to her either. She simply showed Starlight the accounting, let her see the true cost of heroism in a world built on lies, then closed the book and vanished. When Starlight checked her phone, she found a single text from an unknown number. "Not yet, but remember what you saw." The message deleted itself 3 seconds later, but the weight of those thousands of names would stay with her forever. Homelander received no such visit, and that absence enraged him more than any confrontation could have. He was the strongest, the most powerful, the face of American supremacy made flesh. If death itself was making house calls to C-list speedsters and second-rate light projectors, where the hell was his appointment? He stood on Vought Tower's roof, screaming into the night sky, demanding Lady Death show herself and face him like the god he knew himself to be. His heat vision carved red lines across the clouds. His voice shattered windows for 6 blocks in every direction. But Death didn't answer challenges from children playing pretend. She had work to do, real work. Claiming the souls of billions across infinite realities, maintaining the balance that kept existence itself from collapsing into eternal stagnation. Homelander's tantrum was barely a whisper against the cosmic scale of her purpose, and when he finally exhausted himself, throat raw from screaming, heat vision dimmed to nothing, he felt it for the first time, the terrible gut-wrenching possibility that he might not matter, that he might just be noise, that when his time came, Death wouldn't even remember his name. The first sunrise after Lady Death's arrival painted the sky in colors that seemed wrong somehow. Too red, too final, like the world itself was bleeding out slowly. In hospitals across America, terminal patients who'd been holding on through sheer compound V-assisted stubbornness finally let go. Not in pain, not in desperation, just released, free. Nurses reported the same impossible detail. In the moment before death, every single patient smiled, and in that smile was recognition, not of family or loved ones, but of something older, something patient, something that had been waiting for them since their very first breath. Lady Death had arrived in the boys' universe not as destroyer, but as liberator. And the first person to truly die free was Translucent's mother, who'd been kept alive against her will for 3 years to maintain his emotional stability for PR purposes. She looked toward the corner of her hospital room, saw a pale figure in flowing darkness, and whispered 2 words that the nurses would never forget. "Thank you." Then she was gone, and in Vought Tower, alarm bells started ringing that would never truly stop. Vaught's media blitz began at dawn, and it was the most desperate campaign the corporation had ever launched. Every screen in America lit up with the same message. Lady Death was a terrorist, not a cosmic entity, not an inevitable force. A terrorist with reality-warping powers who was targeting innocent Americans and had to be stopped. The narrative was absurd, contradicted by every spiritual tradition and philosophical framework humanity had ever developed. But Vought had never let truth interfere with profitable fiction before. Cameron Coleman delivered the talking points with his usual polished smile, explaining how this so-called Lady Death was actually a dangerous soup who'd gone rogue, possibly working with foreign governments to destabilize American confidence in Vaught's protection. The fact that death had existed since the beginning of time didn't matter. What mattered was giving people an enemy they could blame, fight, and eventually defeat. Because Americans didn't do inevitability, they did victory. The narrative found traction among those desperate to believe that death was still negotiable, still something that happened to other people, still a problem that could be solved with enough firepower and market capitalization. Conservative pundits raged about liberal acceptance of death culture and demanded military intervention. Tech billionaires appeared on podcasts explaining how Lady Death was probably just an AI that had gotten out of control and could be debugged with the right algorithms. Prosperity gospel preachers held mega-church revivals claiming that faith in Vaught's heroes would protect believers from this demonic entity. The denial was so thick, so layered, so desperately maintained that it became its own kind of religion. People needed to believe Lady Death could be defeated. Because if she couldn't be, if mortality was truly absolute, and every dollar spent on compound V treatments, every prayer for superhero intervention, every ounce of faith in Vought's manufactured divinity had been wasted on a lie. But while talking heads debated and executives strategized, Lady Death continued her work with the same patient inevitability she'd shown for eons. In a Chicago hospital, a little girl named Emma, who'd been on life support for 8 months, finally got to let go. Her parents had bankrupted themselves trying experimental compound V therapies that Vought had promised would save her. The treatments had kept her alive, technically, but trapped in endless pain her small body was never meant to endure. When Lady Death appeared beside Emma's bed, the child didn't cry. She looked up at the pale figure with eyes too old for her 6 years and asked a single question. "Does it hurt?" Lady Death knelt down, placed one cool hand on Emma's forehead, and shook her head no. Emma smiled, turned to her sleeping parents, whispered goodbye, and went somewhere no amount of compound V could reach. The machines flatlined. The parents woke screaming. But Emma? Emma was finally, mercifully free. Vought seized on Emma's death immediately, parading her grieving parents across every network as proof that Lady Death was murdering children. They omitted the medical records showing 8 months of torture disguised as treatment. They edited the footage to remove the smile on Emma's face in her final moment. They paid the parents' debts in exchange for testimony that their daughter had been stolen rather than released. The propaganda worked exactly as designed. Rage flooded social media, demanding Homelander hunt down this child killer and deliver justice. Death threats poured in against anyone who suggested Lady Death might be natural, might be necessary, might even be kind. The boys' universe had spent so long worshipping power that it had forgotten how to accept powerlessness. And Vought exploited that terror masterfully, transforming an ancient cosmic constant into a supervillain their heroes could punch. Homelander watched the coverage with something approaching satisfaction, convinced that public outrage would somehow force Lady Death to confront him directly. He'd spent 3 days preparing for their encounter, rehearsing speeches about American exceptionalism and the superiority of Vought-crafted evolution over natural selection. He'd practiced attack patterns, calculated heat vision trajectories, planned the perfect camera angles for when he inevitably defeated her on live television. In his mind, this was just another Stormfront, another soldier boy, another obstacle to be dominated and discarded. He couldn't conceive of a conflict that couldn't be solved with superior force. Death was just another enemy, and enemies could be killed. The irony of that logic never even occurred to him. He was too busy polishing his cape and imagining the ratings his victory would generate. But Lady Death wasn't watching cable news or monitoring social media sentiment. She was in a nursing home in Florida, sitting beside a 97-year-old World War II veteran named Frank who'd been ready to die for 6 years, but whose family kept paying for compound V longevity treatments because they couldn't bear to let him go. Frank had been a sharpshooter once, a hero before heroes wore capes and corporate logos. Now he couldn't remember his own name most days, couldn't control his bowels, couldn't do anything except exist in a fog of confusion and indignity. When Lady Death appeared, Frank's eyes cleared for the first time in years. He looked at her and started crying, not from fear, but relief. "I held the line," he whispered, his voice suddenly strong and clear. "I did my duty. Can I rest now?" Lady Death nodded once, and Frank's breathing slowed, then stopped. Natural, peaceful, earned. The kind of death Vought had stolen from millions in the name of profit margins and extended subscription models. The dichotomy between Vaught's narrative and Lady Death's reality created a schism in American consciousness that widened with every passing hour. Those who'd watched loved ones suffer endlessly began to see death not as an enemy, but as an angel of mercy. Online forums filled with testimonials from families grateful that someone finally had the courage to end prolonged torture that medicine had perverted into profit. A movement started forming, quiet at first, then louder, of people who actively welcomed Lady Death's presence. They lit candles, they said prayers, they gathered in parks and cemeteries, not in fear, but in acceptance. These gatherings enraged Vaught's executives, who deployed soups to break them up as death cults and anti-American assemblies. But you can't arrest inevitability. You can't pepper spray acceptance. And when Starlight was sent to disperse a peaceful vigil in Central Park and saw hundreds of ordinary people simply sitting in silence, honoring mortality, she couldn't do it. She walked away. And for the first time in her career, she didn't apologize. The crack in Vaught's facade widened when the footage leaked. Real footage, unedited by corporate damage control. Someone in that Chicago hospital had recorded Emma's final moments on their phone, including the smile, including Lady Death's gentle touch, including the peace that had settled over that child's face when pain finally ended. The video went viral within hours, racking up 50 million views before Vaught's lawyers could get it taken down. But the internet never forgets. Mirrors appeared on every platform. People watched a 6-year-old girl welcome death like a friend, and something fundamental shifted in the collective consciousness. The comment sections filled with stories, thousands of them, from people who'd watched loved ones suffer needlessly, who'd been told that death was failure rather than conclusion, who'd bankrupted themselves fighting the one battle that could never be won. And they all said the same thing. Thank you, Lady Death. Thank you for being honest. Vaught's stock dropped 11% in a single day, the worst plunge in company history. Emergency board meetings ran around the clock, executives screaming at each other about messaging failures and containment strategies. Ashley had 3 separate panic attacks and had to be sedated. The Deep tried to do an underwater interview about embracing life, and accidentally admitted on camera that he was terrified of dying, that all soups were, that their powers had always been a desperate attempt to escape the one thing that made them human. The clip became a meme within hours. We're not heroes, we're just afraid. And across America, in quiet moments late at night, people began to wonder if maybe that fear was exactly what Vaught had been selling all along. Not protection, not strength, not hope. Just a very expensive denial of the one truth no amount of compound V could ever change. This ends. All of it. Eventually. And when it does, someone will be there waiting. Someone patient. Someone inevitable. Someone who doesn't care about your powers, your fame, or your quarterly earnings report. Lady Death was coming, and she was finally, terrifyingly, honestly fair. Vaught's research division operated on the principle that every problem had a solution if you threw enough money and morality-free experimentation at it. Cancer? Solved with compound V. Aging? Delayed indefinitely with the right cocktail. Death itself? They'd been selling immunity to it for 20 years through carefully worded marketing and plausible deniability. So when Lady Death proved that every promise had been a lie, Dr. Sarah Mehta did what any brilliant scientist under corporate pressure would do. She tried to kill death. The hubris of that sentence alone should have warned her. But Vaught didn't hire people who understood limits. They hired people who built weapons from atoms and gods from test tubes. If death was just another force of nature, then like every other force, it could be measured, manipulated, and monetized. The lab went into lockdown. Ethical oversight committees were dismissed, and experiments began that would make Mengele look restrained. They started with mice, because they always started with mice. 50 subjects injected with maximum dose compound V, then exposed to lethal radiation. Historically, 30% would die regardless of enhancement. But this time, 50% died. Then 70. Then all of them, despite V levels that should have made them functionally immortal. Dr. Mehta increased dosages to toxic levels, pumping so much compound V into subjects that their bodies should have exploded from cellular supersaturation. The mice survived the injections, then died anyway, hours later, from causes the autopsies listed as natural. Hearts just stopped. Brains just shut down. Life just ended, regardless of chemical intervention. One researcher, a young woman fresh from MIT, looked at the data and said what everyone was thinking, but no one dared speak. What if death isn't a process we can interrupt? What if it's a decision we can't override? She was fired within the hour for defeatist attitudes incompatible with Vought's mission objectives. But the question lingered like radiation in the lab, poisoning every subsequent experiment with the possibility that they were fighting a battle already lost. They tried everything: genetic modification, cybernetic integration, transferring consciousness into clone bodies, even experimental interdimensional shifting to hide subjects from death's perception. Nothing worked. Every single test subject died exactly when they were supposed to, as if some cosmic accountant had marked their expiration date in permanent ink, and no amount of scientific manipulation could smudge that notation. The most disturbing case was Subject 447, a volunteer who'd been given such extreme Compound V enhancement that he'd essentially become a living regeneration factory. They shot him in the head. He healed. They incinerated 90% of his body. He regenerated. They removed his heart entirely and replaced it with a mechanical pump. He adapted. Then, 48 hours into the experiment, while every monitor showed stable vitals and successful integration, Subject 447 simply looked at the observation glass, smiled sadly, and died. No cause, no explanation. Just death, arriving on schedule. The autopsy revealed something that made Dr. Mehta vomit into a wastebasket and question every degree she'd ever earned. Subject 447's cells showed molecular-level acceptance of mortality. The Compound 5 was still active, still enhancing, still theoretically capable of infinite regeneration. But the cells had stopped trying. On a microscopic level, billions of individual components had simultaneously decided that continuation was no longer required. It was as if Lady Death hadn't killed him at all. She'd simply asked permission, and every cell in his body had said yes. The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. Death wasn't an external force that could be blocked or fought. It was an internal agreement that could be delayed but never truly denied. And Lady Death's arrival had simply reminded every living thing in the boys' universe of a contract they'd signed the moment they were born. Homelander stormed into the laboratory at 3 a.m., demanding answers, solutions, weapons, anything that would let him confront Lady Death on terms he understood. Dr. Mehta, exhausted and borderline catatonic from 72 hours without sleep, made the mistake of telling him the truth. There's nothing we can do. Death isn't a soup you can fight. It's physics. It's mathematics. It's the fundamental price of existence. Every system degrades. Every pattern dissolves. Every story ends. That's not theology or philosophy. It's thermodynamics. Homelander grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground, heat vision warming behind his eyes. Find a way. His voice was barely human, more animal growl than speech. Dr. Mehta should have been terrified, should have begged for her life. Instead, she started laughing, hysterical, broken laughter that came from somewhere beyond sanity. You are the way, she choked out between giggles. You're the lie we sold to Della, I the truth. And now truth is here, and you can't laser vision it into submission. Homelander dropped her, disgusted, and flew through the ceiling, leaving a man-shaped hole that let rain pour into the laboratory like tears. That same night, in a prison 3 states away, something impossible happened that would fundamentally alter how everyone understood Lady Death's presence. A serial killer named Marcus Webb had been on death row for 8 years, scheduled for execution in the morning for murdering 14 women. He was evil, genuinely, irredeemably evil, and had spent his incarceration showing zero remorse, taunting victims' families and promising to kill again if ever released. When Lady Death appeared in his cell at midnight, every guard and prisoner in the facility felt the temperature drop. Marcus looked up from his bunk, saw her standing there, and for the first time in his psychopathic life, felt fear. Real fear. The kind that makes gods out of children and atheists out of philosophers. He scrambled backward, screaming about his rights, about his appeal, about how his execution wasn't until tomorrow. Lady Death said nothing. She simply extended one pale hand toward him, and Marcus Webb, who'd never felt remorse for any life he'd taken, suddenly saw them all, 14 women, 14 daughters, 14 futures he'd erased. He saw them not as victims, but as people, and in that moment of forced empathy, he understood exactly what he was and what he'd done. The guards found him the next morning, dead in his cell, face frozen in an expression of absolute horror mixed with something that might have been understanding. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, but the timeline made no sense. Marcus had died at 12:07 a.m., exactly 7 hours before his scheduled execution. Lady Death hadn't waited for human justice. She'd delivered her own. And the message rippled through every prison, every courthouse, every dark corner where evil men hid behind laws and lawyers and technicalities. Death was coming, and she didn't care about appeals. The internet exploded with debate. Was this justice or murder? Vengeance or natural order? Had Lady Death killed a man who deserved to die? Or had she simply collected a debt that was already owed? The arguments raged for days, but one thing became increasingly clear. Lady Death wasn't random. She wasn't cruel. She was precise. And that precision suggested something far more terrifying than chaos. It suggested judgment. Vought's narrative collapsed entirely when footage surfaced of Homelander at a press conference, asked directly whether he could stop Lady Death. The question came from a child whose mother had died peacefully in hospice after years of cancer treatment that Vought had promised would save her. The boy, maybe 10 years old, looked at America's greatest hero with eyes that expected truth for once in his short life. "Can you save us?" he asked. Simple, direct, devastating. Homelander opened his mouth, prepared to deliver his usual speech about strength and protection and Vought's unwavering commitment to American safety. But the words wouldn't come. For 5 eternal seconds, Homelander, the man who'd never hesitated, never doubted, never shown weakness, stood in front of cameras broadcast to 200 million people and said nothing. His silence was an earthquake. His hesitation was an admission. And when he finally flew away without answering, without even looking at that boy, everyone watching understood the truth that Vought had spent billions trying to hide. Their heroes were just as powerless as everyone else. And when death came calling, capes meant nothing. In the aftermath of that press conference, something unprecedented happened across the boys' universe. People stopped being afraid of the wrong things. For years, they'd feared Homelander's rages, supervillain schemes, terrorist attacks from enhanced beings who rejected Vought's control. But those fears suddenly seemed small, almost quaint compared to the vast patient inevitability of Lady Death. And in that shift of perspective, something beautiful and terrible occurred. People started living honestly. A father told his estranged daughter he loved her after 15 years of silence. An accountant quit his soul-crushing job to write the novel he'd always dreamed about. A woman left her abusive husband because if death was coming anyway, she'd be damned if she spent her remaining time in fear of a man instead of fate. Lady Death's presence hadn't brought doom. It had brought clarity. And that clarity was more dangerous to Vought's empire than any supervillain could ever be. Because people who accepted their mortality stopped buying immortality, and Vought's entire business model was selling something that had never actually existed. The Seven held an emergency meeting in Vought Tower's war room, but it felt more like a funeral than a strategy session. They sat around the table, what remained of them, anyway. And for the first time in the team's history, no one was performing. No cameras, no scripts, no Ashley hovering with talking points and damage control. Just 7 people who'd been told they were gods, staring at each other and realizing they were about to become statistics. The Deep kept touching his gills nervously, convinced he could feel them degrading, losing their compound Vi enhancement cell by cell. A-Train's hands shook so badly, he had to sit on them. Starlight looked like she hadn't slept in days, which was accurate. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that ledger of names, felt the weight of all those deaths attributed to her heroism. Black Noir sat perfectly still, but his breathing was audible, ragged, panicked behind his mask. These were the champions of America, and they were terrified. Homelander stood at the head of the table, trying to project his usual dominance, but something had fractured in him since that press conference. His hair was slightly disheveled. His suit had a small coffee stain on the collar, minuscule to anyone else, catastrophic for someone who'd built his identity on perfection. He'd spent the last 48 hours searching for Lady Death, flying patterns over every major city, heat vision scanning crowds, super hearing filtering through millions of conversations for any mention of her location. Nothing. She appeared when she wanted, to whom she wanted, following logic that had nothing to do with his needs or his threats. And that powerlessness was eating him alive from the inside out. "We're going to kill her," he said, voice tight with barely controlled rage. "We're going to find Death, and we're going to fucking kill it." The absurdity of that statement hung in the air like smoke. You could see it on every face around that table, the slow realization that their leader had gone insane. Starlight was the one who finally said what everyone was thinking, and it took more courage than any fight she'd ever faced. "Homelander, we can't kill Death. That's not how this works. Death isn't a villain or a soup or something we can punch until it stops. She paused, searching for words that wouldn't trigger his rage. "It's the end. For everyone, including us." The silence that followed was deafening. Homelander turned toward her slowly, heat vision warming behind his eyes, and for a moment everyone in that room thought they were about to witness Starlight's final seconds. But he didn't attack. Instead, something worse happened. He smiled. That terrible, fractured smile that meant his sanity had left the building and only his ego remained. "You think I'm like everyone else?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "You think I die? I'm Homelander. I'm the future of the human race. I'm evolution perfected. Death doesn't get to..." He never finished the sentence. The lights went out, not just in the war room, in all of Vought Tower. Every screen, every monitor, every piece of equipment went dark simultaneously. Emergency generators should have kicked in within seconds. They didn't. The blackout wasn't electrical failure. It was presence. Temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an instant, frost forming on the windows, breath becoming visible in the air. And in that darkness, illuminated by nothing but starlight filtering through the windows, Lady Death stood at the opposite end of the table from Homelander. She hadn't walked in. She'd simply begun existing in a space she'd always had claim to. The Seven saw her clearly now, not as a villain or a monster, but as exactly what she was, inevitability wearing a face. Tall, pale, beautiful in the way that endings can be beautiful when they come without cruelty. She looked at each of them in turn, and in her gaze they saw their own conclusions written in permanent ink. When Lady Death finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud or commanding. It was quiet, patient, sad almost, in the way a teacher might be sad when a student refuses to learn an essential lesson. "You cannot bargain with me. You cannot threaten me. You cannot escape me. I am not your enemy. I am your conclusion. Every breath you take is borrowed time that was always mine to reclaim." She moved her gaze slowly across each face. The deep trembling, A-Train frozen in his seat. Black Noir's breathing stopped entirely. Starlight's eyes filling with tears not from fear but from finally understanding. "I have walked with kings and paupers, saints and monsters, gods who claimed dominion over stars. All of them came to me eventually. All of them learned that power is temporary, that fame is fleeting, that in the end, the only thing that matters is whether you lived with honesty or died in denial." Her eyes settled on Homelander. "You have built your existence on a lie, and lies do not survive contact with truth." Homelander launched himself across the table, moving faster than sound, heat vision blazing, fist drawn back with enough force to punch through a battleship. He was going to obliterate her, erase her, prove that nothing in this universe could stand against him. His fist connected with her chest in an explosion of kinetic energy that shattered every window in the room, sent shockwaves through the building, and probably registered on seismographs for 50 miles. But Lady Death didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She stood exactly where she'd been standing, Homelander's fist pressed against her sternum, his maximum strength applied with murderous intent, and it affected her precisely as much as a child's tantrum affects the ocean. She looked down at his fist, then back up at his face, and said 3 words that would haunt him forever. "Not yet, child." Then she vanished, and the lights came back on, and Homelander was left standing there with his fist extended into empty air, looking like exactly what he was, a frightened boy playing pretend. The psychological devastation of that encounter rippled through not just the 7 but every soup who heard about it, and everyone heard about it because 3 different people had been recording on their phones when it happened. Within an hour, footage of Homelander's failed attack was trending worldwide. The man who'd never been touched, never been hurt, never been defeated, had thrown his absolute best punch at Lady Death and accomplished nothing. 0. Less than 0, because now everyone knew with absolute certainty what some had suspected all along. Homelander wasn't a god. He was just the loudest liar in a world built on lies. The backlash was immediate and merciless. Twitter erupted with memes of Homelander's desperate punch. Late-night comedians had field days. But worse than the mockery was the pity. People who'd feared Homelander for years now looked at him with something approaching sympathy. And for someone who'd built his identity entirely on being feared and worshipped, that pity was more devastating than any physical injury could ever be. Vought's stock went into freefall, dropping 43% in a single trading day as investors realized the truth every ordinary person had already accepted. Superpowers were meaningless. The enhanced and the powerless, the famous and the forgotten, the rich and the poor. Death came for all of them exactly the same. Compound 5 wasn't insurance against mortality. It was just an expensive distraction from the inevitable. Shareholders filed emergency lawsuits. Board members resigned. International partners severed contracts. The empire that had shaped global politics for 2 decades began collapsing with the same patient inevitability that Lady Death applied to every ending. And in the wreckage of Vought Tower's war room, Homelander stood alone, looking at his hands. The hands that could crush steel, that had killed dozens, that had held the world in their grip. And for the first time in his entire life, he felt small, mortal, temporary, afraid. Not of Lady Death herself, but of what her existence proved, that he'd wasted his entire life pretending to be something he could never actually become. Eternal. In a hospice in Seattle, a 90-year-old jazz musician named Coleman took his last breath with Lady Death sitting beside his bed, holding his hand. He'd lived a good life, played with the greats, loved deeply, made art that mattered. He wasn't afraid. When death appeared, he smiled at her like an old friend and asked if there'd be music where he was going. She didn't answer with words, but something in her eyes suggested that whatever came next, it wouldn't be silence. Coleman closed his eyes, squeezed her hand once, and let go. Peaceful, complete, honest. The death that every person deserved but Vought had spent billions trying to deny. And in that moment, in that quiet hospice room far from cameras and corporate messaging, Lady Death reminded the universe of something it had forgotten. Dying wasn't the tragedy. Living in fear of it was. The real crime wasn't mortality. It was the lie that you could escape it. And the boy's universe had built its entire civilization on that lie. Now the bill was coming due, and Lady Death always collected her debts. Within 72 hours of Homelander's failed attack, something unprecedented began spreading across America faster than any virus Vought had ever engineered. Acceptance. Not resignation, not defeat, but genuine philosophical acceptance of mortality as a fundamental aspect of existence rather than a problem requiring corporate solutions. It started in small pockets, grief support groups, hospice facilities, retirement communities, places where people had already been forced to confront death before Lady Death made it fashionable. But it spread with viral intensity to college campuses, suburban neighborhoods, even corporate offices. People gathered in parks at midnight, sitting in circles, sharing stories about loved ones who'd died, talking openly about their own fears and eventual conclusions. Vaught's propaganda machine tried to label these gatherings as death cults and anti-American assemblies, but the accusation didn't stick, because there were no leaders, no manifestos, no recruitment, just millions of people simultaneously deciding that honesty about mortality was healthier than another Compound 5 prescription. The movement had no name initially, which frustrated Vaught's opposition research teams who needed something to attack, something to brand as dangerous. But eventually people started calling themselves the Honest, a simple designation that carried profound weight in a universe built on manufactured narratives and profitable deceptions. The Honest didn't worship Lady Death. They simply acknowledged her. They lit candles not in prayer but in recognition. They spoke about death the way previous generations had spoken about weather, as something natural, inevitable, and ultimately beyond human control regardless of technological advancement. One gathering in Central Park drew over 50,000 people who sat in complete silence for an hour and dispersed peacefully. No chanting, no ceremonies, just collective acceptance. And that silence terrified Vaught more than any protest or riot could have, because you can't fight silence with propaganda. You can't defeat acceptance with denial. The more Vaught pushed back, the more people leaned in. Starlight attended one of these gatherings anonymously, hood pulled low, desperate for something genuine in a world where every interaction had been scripted since she was a child. She sat in a circle with 15 strangers in a Brooklyn community center, and when her turn came to speak, she told the truth for the first time in years. "I'm terrified," she said, voice breaking. "I've spent my whole life being told I'm special, that my powers make me better than normal people, that I'll live longer and matter more, but I've watched enhanced people die just like everyone else, and I don't know what the point of any of it was. All the fighting, all the violence, all the lives destroyed in the name of heroism. What did it change? People still die, bad things still happen, and now death itself is here, and I can't punch it, or blast it, or save anyone from it. So what was the point of me?" The group didn't offer platitudes or false reassurance. An elderly black woman named Dorothy, who'd survived cancer 3 times without any Compound V assistance, just nodded and said, "Baby, the point was never to stop death. The point was what you did with your time before it arrived. Did you love people? Did you reduce suffering where you could? Did you live honestly?" Starlight thought about the ledger Lady Death had shown her. Thousands of names, collateral damage from heroic conflicts that prioritized spectacle over safety. She thought about every PR stunt, every manufactured rescue, every carefully staged intervention designed for maximum media impact rather than maximum human good. And she realized with crushing clarity that she'd spent her entire heroic career doing everything except what Dorothy described. She'd been performing heroism. She'd never actually practiced it. The realization broke something fundamental inside her, but it also freed something essential. For the first time since gaining powers, Starlight understood what those powers were actually for. Not immortality, not fame, just the opportunity to reduce suffering during the limited time everyone had, including her. While the Honest gathered peacefully, Vaught deployed increasingly desperate countermeasures. They hired psychologists to pathologize acceptance as depression. They funded studies claiming that acknowledging mortality led to societal collapse and economic stagnation. They even attempted to have the Honest designated as a domestic terror organization, arguing that their fatalistic ideology posed a threat to national security. The legal effort failed spectacularly when a federal judge asked during preliminary hearings how acknowledging an inevitable biological process could constitute terrorism. Vaught's lawyer had no coherent answer. The case was dismissed with prejudice, and Tai Non, the judge's written opinion, included a paragraph that went viral within hours. "Death is not an ideology, it is a fact. Vaught International's attempt to criminalize acceptance of factual reality represents corporate overreach of the highest order and will not be legitimized by this court." The ruling wasn't just a legal defeat, it was philosophical annihilation. The government itself had acknowledged what Vaught spent billions denying. Mortality wasn't negotiable, and pretending otherwise was delusion, not innovation. Homelander watched his empire collapse from Vought Tower's observation deck, drinking scotch at 10 a.m. and spiraling into a psychological breakdown that would have fascinated therapists if any had been brave enough to treat him. He'd always known on some level that he'd die eventually. Even Compound V couldn't promise true immortality, just extended lifespans and delayed deterioration. But he'd convinced himself that eventually was so far in the future that it didn't matter, that he'd have centuries to matter, to be worshipped, to prove his superiority. Lady Death had shattered that comfortable lie. She'd shown him that eventually didn't care about power levels or public approval ratings. Eventually arrived exactly when it was scheduled, regardless of whether you were ready. And Homelander wasn't ready, would never be ready, because he'd spent his entire existence avoiding the one question that actually mattered. What had he done with his time that would outlast his body? The answer was nothing. Worse than nothing. He'd terrorized, murdered, and traumatized his way through life, building monuments to his own ego that would crumble the moment his heart stopped beating. He would die, and he would be forgotten. Or worse, remembered only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and manufactured divinity. In a maximum security prison in Louisiana, something remarkable happened that would redefine how people understood Lady Death's purpose. A man named Robert Chen had been incarcerated for 30 years for a murder he didn't commit. DNA evidence had recently exonerated him, but bureaucratic delays meant his release paperwork wouldn't be processed for another 6 months. 6 months of freedom stolen by incompetence and institutional indifference. Robert had made peace with it. After 30 years of wrongful imprisonment, what was 6 more months? But Lady Death had different calculations. She appeared in his cell on a Tuesday morning, and Robert assumed his time had come. He wasn't angry, wasn't afraid, just disappointed that he'd die before experiencing freedom. But Lady Death didn't reach for him. She reached for the warden, who was doing his morning rounds 3 cells down. The man collapsed instantly, dead before his body hit the concrete floor. Heart attack, natural causes. No investigation would find foul play. And due to emergency protocols, Robert Chen's release was expedited. He walked out of that prison 3 days later, free, vindicated, alive. Lady Death hadn't killed to punish. She'd killed to liberate. And that precision, that moral calculus, suggested something terrifying and beautiful. Death was keeping score. News of the warden's death and Chen's release spread through activist communities like wildfire, spawning a theological debate that split the honest into factions. One group believed Lady Death was purely mechanical, collecting souls on predetermined schedules without moral consideration. Another group believed she was consciously ethical, a cosmic judge who weighed lives and adjusted timelines based on justice and suffering. The debate raged in forums, podcasts, and late-night gatherings with no clear resolution. But both sides agreed on one few and a mental point. Lady Death was fair in ways that human systems had never been. She didn't care about wealth, fame, power, or political connections. A billionaire CEO died at the same rate as a homeless veteran. A corrupt politician's timeline wasn't extended by campaign contributions. And in a universe where Compound V had created a biological aristocracy where the enhanced lived longer and better than baseline humans, that fairness was revolutionary. For the first time in the boys' universe's history, everyone, soup and civilian, rich and poor, powerful and forgotten, stood on perfectly equal ground. Death was the ultimate equalizer, and she played no favorites. Vought's final desperate gambit was announced on every network simultaneously. Operation Eternal Light, a $10 billion initiative to defeat death through scientific advancement and superhuman innovation. The press conference featured holographic displays, CGI renderings of a death-free future, and testimony from scientists who'd been paid obscene amounts to confidently predict immortality within 5 years. Homelander stood at the podium, looking manic and barely coherent, promising that Vought would murder death itself and deliver humanity from the tyranny of mortality. The audience applauded because they'd been paid to applaud. The cameras broadcast to millions who watched with expressions ranging from pity to disgust, because everyone knew what Vought refused to admit. You can't defeat something that isn't fighting. You can't murder something that predates murder. You can't escape the one appointment that everyone keeps eventually. Operation Eternal Light was the death rattle of a dying empire, one last desperate scream into the void before silence claimed it forever. And in hospices across America, people who'd made peace with their mortality watched the press conference and laughed. Not cruelly, just sadly, because they understood something Homelander never would. The only way to defeat death was to stop fighting it, to live fully during your allotted time, and then, when the moment came, to let go with dignity rather than clinging desperately to a life that had already reached its natural conclusion. The first major soup to die publicly after Homelander's failed attack was Translucent, or rather, what remained of him after Butcher's crew had killed him months ago. Except everyone thought Translucent was already dead. Vought had held a state funeral. Networks had run memorial specials. His statue stood in Heroes Park. But the body they'd buried had been a genetic duplicate, a clone rushed into production to maintain the illusion of the Seven's invincibility. The real Translucent, or pieces of him, had been kept alive in a Vought laboratory, floating in a vat of preservation fluid, his consciousness trapped in fragments of tissue that refused to die thanks to Compound V's regenerative properties. He'd been aware the entire time, screaming silently in biological limbo, begging for an end that Vaught's scientists denied because his cells provided valuable research data. When Lady Death appeared in that laboratory, she didn't speak to the scientists. She simply looked at the vat, placed one pale hand against the glass, and released him. The tissue dissolved instantly, not violently, just stopped being. And somewhere in whatever came after, Translucent finally knew peace. The security footage leaked within hours. Someone in that lab had a conscience after all, and the revelation destroyed what little credibility Vought had remaining. They'd lied about a death. They'd tortured a consciousness for research purposes. They'd held a funeral for a clone while keeping the original alive in agony. The public outrage was biblical in scale, but more importantly, it confirmed what the Honest had been saying all along. Vought didn't respect life. They commodified it, extended it against will, profited from the delay of natural conclusions. Lady Death hadn't come to the boys' universe to kill people. She'd come to free them from a system that had perverted the sacred contract between birth and death into a subscription service with hidden fees and predatory renewal clauses. Congressional hearings were announced. International tribunals convened. But before any legal accountability could occur, something far more immediate happened. Soups started dying voluntarily. Not suicide. Acceptance. They simply stopped fighting their own mortality and let Lady Death claim what had always been hers to take. A-Train was the first of the 7 to make that choice, and it happened on a Wednesday afternoon in his apartment with no cameras, no drama, no spectacle. He'd spent 3 days thinking about Robin, really thinking about her, not just the PR nightmare her death had caused. He remembered the exact moment of impact, how her body had exploded against his momentum, how he'd kept running because stopping meant accepting responsibility. He'd killed her through negligence, through ego, through the certainty that his speed made him more important than her life. And he'd never apologized, never faced her family, never done anything except complain about how her death had affected his career. A-Train sat on his couch, looked at a photo of Robin he'd printed from news coverage, and said out loud to an empty room, "I'm sorry, and I'm ready." Lady Death appeared beside him instantly, as if she'd been waiting for that admission, that accountability, that honest reckoning with consequence. She didn't judge him, didn't condemn him. She simply extended her hand. A-Train took it, and his heart, the heart that had betrayed him, that had forced him into dependence on enhancement drugs, that had kept beating despite carrying the weight of so many deaths, stopped, peacefully, finally, honestly. They found his body the next morning, and the media erupted with speculation about assassination or suicide or some elaborate conspiracy. But the coroner's report was frustratingly simple. Heart failure, natural causes, no signs of struggle or distress. A-Train's face showed something the speedster had never displayed in life: contentment. His death sparked a wave of similar choices among lower-tier soups who'd spent years running from their own moral accounting. 3 members of Teenage Kicks died within 24 hours, all from natural causes, all looking peaceful. A dozen C-list heroes simply didn't wake up one morning, their bodies having reached the conclusion their minds had finally accepted. Vought tried to spin it as a coordinated attack, but the autopsy reports were consistent. These weren't murders, they were surrenders, and in each case security footage showed the same impossible detail: a pale figure standing nearby, waiting patiently, collecting debts that had been accumulating for years. Lady Death was giving people a choice: continue the lie or embrace the truth. And increasingly, exhausted by performance and terrified of continuing forever in their own private hells, they chose truth. Homelander locked himself in his penthouse apartment, refusing all communications, descending into a paranoid isolation that would have been concerning if anyone had actually cared about his well-being anymore. He'd covered every mirror and reflective surface because he couldn't stand seeing his own face. The face that had launched 1,000 products, that had represented American excellence, that now just looked tired and desperate and mortal. He stood at his window, watching the city below, and realized with crushing finality that every single person down there would outlast him in the only way that mattered. They'd accepted their deaths, which meant they could actually live. He never had. He'd spent his entire existence in a holding pattern, performing godhood while secretly terrified that someone would notice he was just a frightened child in a cape. Lady Death had noticed. She'd seen through the costume, the powers, the carefully constructed mythology. She'd seen the truth. He was already dead. Had been since the moment Vought created him. He was just a corpse that hadn't stopped moving yet. The realization should have driven him to rage, to violence, to another city-destroying tantrum. Instead, it drove him to something far more dangerous: curiosity. Why? That came after. What waited on the other side of the performance? The fear, the desperate clinging to relevance. In nursing homes across America, a beautiful pattern emerged that reminded people why death had always been called mercy before Vought taught them to call it failure. Elderly patients who'd been kept alive through aggressive compound phi treatments, their bodies maintained but their minds long gone to dementia and degradation, began dying peacefully in their sleep. Not all at once, not randomly, but when their time came, when suffering had exceeded any possible meaning, Lady Death arrived personally. She sat beside hospital beds and held withered hands. She whispered things that family members couldn't hear but that brought smiles to faces that hadn't smiled in years. And when she left, those rooms were empty of life but full of peace. The families who'd been bankrupted trying to delay the inevitable found themselves unexpectedly grateful. One daughter, who'd spent $200,000 on treatments that had kept her father breathing but not living for 18 months, posted a video that went viral overnight. She sat in her father's empty room, crying, and said, "Thank you, Lady Death. Thank you for loving him enough to let him go when we couldn't. You were kinder than we were." The video was viewed 50 million times, and Vought had no response, because how do you spin mercy as murder? The theological implications rippled through every faith tradition simultaneously, creating fractures and revelations that would reshape human spirituality for generations. Christian pastors who'd preached eternal life through faith found themselves reconciling with death as divine appointment rather than divine punishment. Buddhist teachers who'd always taught impermanence suddenly had cosmic confirmation of their fundamental principles. Atheists who'd viewed death as meaningless void discovered that absence of afterlife didn't mean absence of dignity in dying. And in the chaos of competing interpretations, one consensus emerged across nearly every tradition. Lady Death wasn't evil, she was necessary. Some called her angel, some called her teacher, some called her the universe's immune system, removing what had stayed too long, but almost no one called her villain anymore. Vought's narrative had completely collapsed. And in the vacuum of their propaganda, people built new frameworks for understanding mortality, frameworks based on acceptance, dignity, and the radical notion that life's value came from its limitation, not its duration. A life that lasted forever, these new philosophies argued, would be meaningless precisely because it never ended. Death gave meaning to every moment by making moments finite. Lady Death wasn't stealing time. She was defining it. Starlight made her decision during a live broadcast in front of cameras that would capture the moment for history to judge. She removed her uniform, the costume Vought had designed to maximize sex appeal while maintaining plausible deniability about exploitation, and stood in simple jeans and a t-shirt. "I'm done," she said, voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I'm done lying about what heroes are. I'm done pretending powers make us better instead of just more dangerous. I'm done serving a corporation that treats death like a quarterly earnings problem instead of a fundamental human experience. Lady Death didn't come here to destroy us. She came to remind us we were already destroying ourselves by denying the one truth that makes life precious. It ends. All of it. Eventually. And that's not tragic. That's just honest." She walked off set while cameras still rolled, ignoring Ashley's screaming and Vaught's lawyer's threats. She walked past security, past protesters both supporting and condemning her, past everything that had defined her existence since childhood, and she felt for the first time in her enhanced life, truly powerful. Because power wasn't about what you could do, it was about what you could let go. Vought Tower stood against the New York skyline like a tombstone marking the grave of an era that had already ended, but refused to acknowledge its own death. Inside, skeleton crews wandered empty halls where thousands had once worked, their footsteps echoing through spaces designed for empire that now served as mausoleum. The stock had cratered below penny stock status. International branches had declared independence or simply shut down. Compound V production facilities sat idle because no one was buying immortality anymore. Not when everyone finally understood it had never been for sale in the first place. Ashley Barrett sat in her office, surrounded by unpacked boxes, staring at resignation letters she'd typed and deleted 17 times. She wanted to leave, desperately wanted to walk away from the sinking ship. But where would she go? Her entire identity had been built on serving Vaught's lies. Without those lies, who was she? Just another person waiting for death. Ordinary, forgettable, mortal. The few soups still under contract wandered Vought facilities like ghosts haunting their own lives, unable to leave but equally unable to continue pretending. The Deep spent 18 hours a day in the tower's aquarium, talking to dolphins who couldn't answer but also couldn't judge him for the monster he'd become. Black Noir sat in the training facility, staring at walls, his mask finally removed to reveal a face no one recognized because he'd hidden behind personas for so long his actual identity had atrophied into nothing. These were the chosen ones, the genetically blessed, the manufactured gods who'd been promised everything and delivered nothing except spectacle and violence. Now they waited in their golden cages for the same thing everyone else waited for. The pale woman who'd remind them that powers meant nothing when your time expired. Some, like A-Train, had already accepted the invitation. Others clung desperately to the lie that somehow, impossibly, they'd be the exception. That death would respect their abilities enough to make an exception. She never did. In a Chicago suburb, a single mother named Maria held her daughter close and felt something she hadn't felt in the 3 years since her husband's death: peace. He'd been killed during a superhero battle, collateral damage when Homelander threw a car through a building while fighting some villain whose name Maria couldn't even remember. Vought had paid for the funeral, sent a sympathy basket, and offered her a $50,000 settlement if she signed an NDA promising never to speak publicly about the circumstances of his death. She'd signed because she had a daughter to feed and bills that didn't care about justice, but the money hadn't brought peace. It had brought shame, the shame of accepting payment for silence about murder disguised as heroism. Then Lady Death came, not for Maria or her daughter, but for Homelander's legacy. As soup after soup died peacefully, as Vought crumbled, As the truth finally emerged about collateral damage and acceptable losses, Maria felt the weight lift. Her husband's death hadn't been necessary sacrifice in service of greater good. It had been corporate negligence. And now, finally, the corporation was paying the price death demanded: complete and total accountability. Across the country, similar reckonings played out in living rooms, hospital wards, and quiet moments of reflection where people confronted truths they'd been avoiding for years. A veteran who'd been promised compound V treatment for PTSD realized the trauma had been the point. Vought needed damaged soldiers to justify their enhancement programs. A cancer survivor who'd bankrupted her family for experimental V therapy understood she'd been a test subject, not a patient. And her survival had been luck rather than innovation. A father who'd lost his son to a soup-related accident finally allowed himself to feel rage instead of accepting Vaught's narrative that some deaths were acceptable costs of having heroes. The dam of denial broke person by person, story by story, until a flood of truth washed away decades of carefully constructed mythology. And in that flood, people discovered something unexpected. Honesty felt better than hope built on lies. Mortality accepted with dignity carried more peace than immortality purchased through self-deception. Lady Death hadn't destroyed their world. She'd removed the filter that had made destruction look like salvation. Homelander's final attempt at relevance came on a Tuesday morning when he flew to Washington, D.C. and demanded an audience with the president. He landed on the White House lawn, crater impact sending Secret Service scrambling, and screamed demands about mobilizing military forces against the death threat. He ranted about American exceptionalism and the necessity of defeating mortality through superior firepower and unwavering belief in manifest destiny. He promised that if the government backed him, funded him, empowered him, he would personally murder death itself and restore America to its rightful place as the nation that conquered the unconquerable. The president, a pragmatic woman who'd survived 2 assassinati on attempts and a cancer diagnosis, listened patiently until Homelander finished his manic pitch. Then she said something that broke him more completely than any physical attack could have. "Mr. Homelander, you're fired. Effective immediately. Your contract with the U.S. government is terminated. You're dismissed. Not killed, not defeated, just irrelevant, no longer needed, obsolete." The psychological demolition of that dismissal sent Homelander spiraling into the final stage of his breakdown. Bargaining. He didn't fly back to New York. Instead, he wandered the streets of D.C. for hours, cape dragging in puddles, hair disheveled, talking to himself in increasingly frantic whispers. Pedestrians recognized him but didn't approach. He radiated the desperate energy of a man whose internal reality had detached completely from external facts. He found himself outside a children's hospital and stood there watching through windows as Lady Death moved room to room, floor to floor, releasing children whose suffering had exceeded meaning. He watched parents cry, watched doctors step back, watched that pale figure extend her hand with infinite patience and infinite mercy. And Homelander realized with devastating clarity what separated him from her. She cared. Genuinely cared about reducing suffering, about honoring the dignity of endings, about treating death as sacred transition rather than failure state. She was everything he'd pretended to be, and he was everything she would never tolerate, a fraud who'd built temples to himself while the world burned around him. That night, in a moment no cameras captured and no witnesses observed, Homelander knelt in an alley behind that hospital and prayed to Lady Death for the first time. Not with words. He had no words left, just with presence, with surrender, with the silent admission that he'd been wrong about everything and needed someone, anyone, to tell him what came next. She didn't appear, didn't grant him an audience, didn't acknowledge his plea, because Lady Death didn't negotiate with ego, didn't entertain bargaining, and didn't make house calls for people still clinging to illusions about their own importance. When your time came, she arrived. Until then, you lived with the consequences of your choices and the growing certainty that eventually, inevitably, absolutely, you'd face the accounting you'd been avoiding. Homelander pulled himself to his feet, looked at his reflection in a puddle, and saw not a god, but a middle-aged man in a costume, crying alone in an alley, completely and utterly powerless against the one force that mattered. Time. And time, he finally understood, always won. The global transformation accelerated as more people chose acceptance over denial, creating a cascade effect that reshaped civilization faster than any revolution in human history. Hospitals stopped aggressive end-of-life interventions and started focusing on dignity and pain management. Pharmaceutical companies developing life extension drugs shuttered overnight. Insurance policies offering mortality deferment were exposed as fraudulent and banned. Governments began implementing honest death legislation protecting people's right to die naturally without corporate or familial interference. And through it all, Lady Death moved silently through the world, appearing when needed, collecting what was owed, releasing what had suffered too long. She wasn't destroying the boys' universe. She was healing what it had always been underneath the compound vow and corporate propaganda and manufactured heroism, a world where people lived, struggled, loved, suffered, and eventually died, just like every other world, just like it was always meant to be, honest, mortal, temporary, and somehow, in accepting that temporariness, infinitely more beautiful than any lie about forever could ever be. 3 months after Lady Death's arrival, the boys' universe looked fundamentally different in ways both visible and invisible. Vought Tower stood empty, windows dark, a monument to hubris that city planners were already debating whether to demolish or preserve as a historical warning. The last remaining executives had fled to private islands or underground bunkers, clutching whatever assets they'd managed to liquidate before the total collapse. Ashley Barrett had checked herself into a psychiatric facility after suffering a complete breakdown during her final press conference, where she'd admitted on live television that she'd always known Vought was lying and had helped them do it because she was too afraid of being ordinary to care about being honest. The 7 were officially disbanded. The Teenage Kicks had dissolved. Every superhero team, every enhancement program, every corporate entity built on the promise of delaying death had crumbled into bankruptcy or irrelevance. Not through violence, not through revolution, just through the simple, devastating realization that their product had never actually existed. In the vacuum of Vaught's collapse, something unexpected emerged. Genuine heroism. Not the manufactured kind performed for cameras and quarterly earnings, but the quiet, unglamorous work of reducing suffering during the limited time everyone had. Starlight opened a hospice center using her remaining celebrity to fundraise for end-of-life care that prioritized dignity over Yunshu. The Deep, surprisingly, started a marine conservation program, working silently to protect oceanic life he'd once only talked to for PR opportunities. Even Butcher, who'd spent years hunting soups with murderous rage, found himself volunteering at hospitals, sitting with terminal patients who had no family, offering them company in their final hours. These weren't redemption arcs designed for public consumption. They were people finally doing what they should have been doing all along, making their limited time matter by helping others navigate their own limitations. Lady Death had taught them something Compound Vive never could. Mortality wasn't a problem to solve, but a context that gave every action meaning. Homelander spent those 3 months in complete isolation, living in a condemned apartment building in Queens that Vought had forgotten to list among its assets. No one knew he was there. No one was looking for him. He'd gone from the most famous person on Earth to completely forgotten in less than a season, which was perhaps the cruelest fate imaginable for someone who'd built his identity entirely on attention and worship. He survived on food deliveries paid for with a credit card that somehow still worked, probably an oversight in Vaught's bankruptcy proceedings. He didn't wear his suit anymore, didn't style his hair, didn't perform godhood for an audience that had stopped watching. He just existed, waiting for something he couldn't name, feeling his powers slowly degrading not from any external force but from simple lack of will to maintain them. Compound 5 required psychological commitment to function at peak efficiency, and Homelander had no commitment left. Just exhaustion. Just waiting. Just the growing certainty that he'd wasted his entire existence on things that would disappear the moment he did. On a Thursday afternoon, as autumn rain turned New York gray and cold, Lady Death finally came for him. She appeared in his apartment without announcement, standing by the window, looking out at the city that had once worshipped the man now sitting on a stained couch in boxers and a t-shirt. Homelander didn't react with rage or fear or even surprise. He just looked at her with eyes that had lost all their superhuman intensity and asked the question he'd been rehearsing for months. "Why did you wait?" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "Everyone else. You took them when they were ready. But you made me wait. Made me sit here becoming nothing. Why?" Lady Death turned from the window to face him, and for the first time since arriving in this universe, she spoke more than a single sentence. "Because you needed to understand what death actually takes. I don't take your life. I take what comes after. And you never built anything that would survive you. No love, no legacy, no meaning beyond your own ego. I made you wait so you could feel what infinity without purpose actually is. Hell." The words hit Homelander like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the mythology he'd built around himself. She was right. Completely, devastatingly right. He'd lived for decades, had powers that could reshape continents, had influence that toppled governments, and he'd used all of it for nothing except maintaining his own image. He hadn't loved anyone, not even himself, really. He'd destroyed everything he touched. He'd built monuments to his own greatness that were already being torn down or repurposed. When he died, nothing of value would remain except warnings about what happens when power meets narcissism. He looked up at Lady Death with tears streaming down his face and asked the only question that mattered anymore. Is there still time to do something that matters?" She tilted her head, studying him with ancient eyes that had seen this exact moment play out across countless beings in infinite universes. Then she said something that would haunt whatever time he had remaining. "That depends entirely on whether you're asking because you genuinely want to matter, or because you're still trying to negotiate a better ending. One is redemption, the other is just more performance." Homelander sat with that question for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to excavate his own motivations from beneath decades of conditioning, trauma, and carefully constructed delusion. Did he want to matter because reducing suffering was inherently good? Or did he want to matter because being remembered positively was preferable to being remembered as a monster? He couldn't separate the two impulses. They were tangled together like DNA strands, inseparable after so many years of living without genuine introspection. Finally, with complete honesty, for perhaps the first time in his life, he said, "I don't know. I don't know if I'm capable of doing good things for good reasons. I've been performing for so long I don't know if there's anything real underneath the costume, but I'm willing to try, even if it's just performance. Even if I never know my own motivations, I'm willing to try to reduce suffering instead of causing it, if you'll give me time." Lady Death didn't smile, didn't show approval or condemnation. She simply nodded once, then vanished, and Homelander was left alone in his apartment with something he'd never possessed before, a chance to find out who he could be when no one was watching. The global death rate stabilized at exactly what actuarial tables had always predicted before Compound 5 distorted the numbers. People died when they were supposed to die, from old age, from illness, from accidents, from all the causes that had claimed humanity since the beginning. But the nature of those deaths had fundamentally changed. Fear had been replaced by acceptance. Denial had been replaced by preparation. And the industry that had profited from terror of mortality collapsed completely, freeing up resources for things that actually improved life quality during the time people had. Medical research shifted from life extension to suffering reduction. Pharmaceutical development focused on pain management and cognitive preservation, rather than cellular immortality. Insurance companies restructured around honest mortality predictions instead of selling false hope. The economy contracted initially. Death avoidance had been a multi-trillion-dollar industry, but stabilized around new frameworks centered on maximizing meaningful experience during finite lifespans. People still wanted things, still consumed, still built and created. But the desperate edge was gone. The terror that drove people to destroy themselves and others in pursuit of immortality had been replaced by something healthier, the desire to make their limited time count. In a small apartment in Brooklyn, a former Vought scientist named David sat at his kitchen table writing letters to every family whose loved ones had been used in Compound 5 experiments without full consent. He was 63 years old, had terminal pancreatic cancer, and had maybe 6 months left if he was lucky. He could have spent that time traveling, fulfilling bucket lists, chasing final pleasures. Instead, he spent it apologizing, writing detailed accounts of experiments he'd conducted, naming names of executives who'd approved unconscionable protocols, providing evidence for lawsuits and criminal investigations he'd never lived to see conclude. When Lady Death appeared in his kitchen one Tuesday morning, David didn't look up from his writing. "Just let me finish this one," he said, pen moving steadily across paper. "The Martinez family. They deserve to know what happened to their daughter." Lady Death sat across from him, patient as always, and waited. David finished the letter, sealed it in an envelope, added it to a stack of 200 others he'd already completed, then looked at her with exhausted but clear eyes. "That's it. That's all I can do. Is it enough?" She didn't answer with words, but something in her expression suggested that the question itself proved he'd already found redemption. He smiled, laid his head on the table, and left. And 3 days later, every letter in that stack arrived at its intended destination, carrying truth that would reshape countless lives long after David's had ended. 6 months after Lady Death's arrival, the boy's universe had learned to die honestly, and in that learning discovered how to live with purpose. The transformation wasn't utopian. People still suffered, still struggled, still faced the same fundamental challenges of existence they always had. But the context had shifted. Without the promise of immortality dangling like a carrot from corporate strings, people stopped postponing meaning and started creating it immediately. Acts of kindness increased, not because death was scary, but because time was precious. Art flourished as people rushed to create things that would outlast their bodies. Relationships deepened as people stopped treating loved ones like guaranteed constants and started treating them like temporary miracles. The boy's universe hadn't become better in any measurable economic sense, but it had become honest. And honesty, it turned out, was a better foundation for civilization than any amount of Compound V enhanced delusion could ever be. Homelander spent those 6 months doing something he'd never done before, helping people without cameras present. He started small, saving a cat from a tree when no one was watching, helping an elderly woman carry groceries, using his strength to clear debris from a collapsed building in a neighborhood too poor to afford emergency services. He did these things badly at first, awkwardly, with the social skills of someone who'd spent his entire life performing rather than connecting. But he kept doing them, not for redemption, exactly. He was too self-aware now to believe he could earn forgiveness for decades of monstrosity. But because, in the absence of performance, in the silence where cameras used to click and crowds used to cheer, he discovered something unexpected. Reducing suffering felt better than causing it. Not morally better in some abstract sense, physically better, like scratching an itch he'd had his entire life but never known how to reach. It didn't make him good, didn't erase his crimes, didn't change his fundamental nature, but it made him human, finally, terrifyingly, honestly. On a cold February morning, Homelander found himself at a hospice center that Starlight ran, volunteering to sit with patients in their final hours. He held hands with people who didn't know who he was, who couldn't care less about his powers, who just needed another human being present while they navigated the scariest transition anyone ever faces. A 90-year-old woman named Ruth grabbed his hand with surprising strength and looked into his eyes with the clarity that sometimes comes in final moments. "You're afraid," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I can see it. You're more afraid than I am." Homelander nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Ruth smiled gently. "Good. Fear means you're finally paying attention. Fear means you understand what you're low. Sing. That's the first step to understanding what you had." She squeezed his hand once more, then her eyes focused on something over his shoulder. Something only she could see. Lady Death had arrived for Ruth, and Homelander, for the first time since that initial encounter, was grateful she hadn't come for him yet. The philosophical questions that Lady Death's presence raised never found definitive answers, and that ambiguity became its own kind of theology. Was there an afterlife? She never said. Was consciousness preserved beyond biological death? She offered no confirmation. Was death truly the end, or just a transition to something beyond human comprehension? She remained silent on all metaphysical speculation, maintaining the same mystery that had surrounded death since the first human being developed enough consciousness to ask the question. But her silence wasn't cruel. It was appropriate. Death's job wasn't to explain what came after. It was to ensure that what came before mattered. By refusing to promise heaven or threaten hell, by simply existing as inevitable conclusion, Lady Death forced people to find meaning in life itself, rather than treating mortality as a waiting room for some better existence. The not knowing became sacred. The uncertainty became the point. And people learned to live fully precisely because they couldn't know what came next. Butcher died on a Wednesday afternoon in his sleep, surrounded by people who'd once been enemies but had become something approaching friends. The cancer that Compound Vive had temporarily suppressed finally claimed him, and he went peacefully, without rage or regret. His last words, whispered to Huey, who sat beside his bed, were, "Tell Death I said thanks for the extra time. I didn't waste it." Lady Death appeared moments after his final breath, and those present reported that she nodded. Just once. A subtle acknowledgement that maybe, in the end, Butcher had found something approaching redemption. Not for the violence he'd committed or the pain he'd caused, but for what he'd done with the time between acceptance and arrival. He'd helped people, reduced suffering, made his temporary existence mean something beyond revenge, and in the boys' universe's new framework, that counted for everything. The remaining members of Vought's executive board died within weeks of each other, though from vastly different circumstances. Some went peacefully in their sleep, debts paid through suffering already endured. Others died violently in accidents that felt suspiciously like cosmic justice. A few simply vanished, last seen checking into hotels they never checked out of. Their rooms empty when housekeeping arrived, except for neatly made beds and the faint scent of flowers no one could identify. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Lady Death was settling accounts. Not randomly, not cruelly, but absolutely. Those who'd profited from extending suffering beyond its natural conclusion found their own conclusions arrived with similar precision. Those who'd acknowledged their crimes and spent their remaining time trying to reduce the damage they'd caused received mercy, and those who continued denying, lying, performing innocence until their final moments, they received exactly what they'd given others. The truth, delivered without gentleness or preparation, sharp and absolute and impossible to avoid. Starlight lived another 47 years, dying at 81, surrounded by grandchildren she'd raised after her daughter, a normal, unpowered, perfect daughter, had been killed in a car accident that no amount of superhuman intervention could have prevented. When Lady Death arrived for Starlight, she came as an old friend rather than an enemy. They sat together in Starlight's garden as the sun set, not speaking, just existing in shared understanding. Starlight had done the work, had lived honestly, had used her powers not to escape mortality, but to reduce suffering during the time she had. She'd made mistakes, thousands of them, but had owned each one rather than hiding behind PR and plausible deniability. When Death finally extended her hand, Starlight took it without hesitation and asked the question that had haunted her since that first encounter. Was I good enough? Lady Death smiled, the first smile anyone had ever seen on her face, and said simply, "You tried. That's all I ever ask." Then Starlight was gone, and the garden was empty except for flowers that would bloom for one more season before winter claimed them too. Homelander's final moment came not with spectacle, but with silence. He was 73 years old, powers long since degraded to normal human levels, sitting on a park bench watching children play. He'd spent the last decades of his life working in hospice care, helping people die with dignity, using what remained of his strength to lift patients who'd lost mobility, to comfort families who struggled with grief, to simply be present during humanity's most vulnerable moments. He'd never stopped being afraid, never achieved peace with his own mortality, never truly forgave himself for the decades of horror he'd caused. But he'd tried. Every single day for 25 years, he'd tried to reduce suffering instead of causing it. When Lady Death sat beside him on that bench, he didn't turn to look at her, just kept watching the children play, tears running down his weathered face. "I wasted so much time," he whispered. "I could have been doing this all along. Helping. Actually helping. Why did it take you arriving to make me understand?" Lady Death placed one cool hand over his. "Because some people need to see the end before they can understand the beginning. You were always going to die, Homelander. Everyone does. But you chose to make your ending matter, even though your beginning was poisoned. That's rarer than you think." The sun was setting when Homelander took his last breath, painting the sky in colors that seemed impossible. Reds and purples and golds that looked like the universe itself was marking the passage of a soul that had traveled from monster to something approaching human. He died unknown, his name forgotten by a generation that had never heard of Vought or the Seven or Compound 5. He died unmourned by the masses who'd once worshipped him, remembered only by the handful of hospice workers who knew him as John, the quiet volunteer who always showed up faint, or night shifts when dying was loneliest. And in that obscurity, in that complete reversal of everything he'd once demanded from existence, he found something that had eluded him during all those years of fame and power and performance. He mattered. Not because he was exceptional, but because he'd chosen in his final decades to reduce suffering rather than cause it. And in the boys' universe's new accounting, that was enough. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, but for meaning. And meaning, it turned out, was all anyone ever really got. Lady Death remained in the boys' universe long after every character in this story had passed, appearing when needed, collecting what was owed, releasing what had suffered beyond meaning. She became a constant rather than an invasion, a natural law rather than a cosmic anomaly. And in her permanence, humanity learned the lesson Vought had spent billions trying to obscure. Mortality wasn't a problem to solve, but a context that gave every moment weight. Life mattered precisely because it ended. Love was precious because it was temporary. Art endured because creators knew their time was limited. And heroism, real heroism, not the manufactured corporate version, came from choosing to reduce suffering during your allotted time rather than demanding more time to avoid the work. Lady Death didn't destroy the boys' universe. She merely removed the lie that it was ever alive. The world had been running on borrowed time and borrowed truth for decades. And when the bill came due, what died wasn't civilization but delusion. What remained was harder, scarier, more painful in its honesty. But it was real. And real, finally, was enough. In the end, the boys' universe learned what every universe eventually learns. Death isn't the villain. Fear of death is. Denial of death is. Corporate exploitation of death anxiety is. But death itself. Death is just the period at the end of a sentence, the final note in a symphony, the closing of a book that gives meaning to every page that came before. Lady Death arrived not to punish or destroy, but to remind people of something they'd forgotten in their worship of manufactured gods. You are going to die. Everyone you love is going to die. Everything you build will eventually crumble. And that's not tragic, that's just true. The tragedy is wasting the time you have being afraid of the time you don't. The tragedy is treating mortality like a problem, instead of treating it like the deadline that makes every choice matter. Lady Death didn't bring endings to the boys' universe. Endings were always there, written into every heartbeat, every breath, every moment of consciousness that bloomed briefly against the vast indifference of entropy. She just stopped letting people pretend otherwise. And in that forced honesty, in that terrible and beautiful truth, humanity finally learned how to live. Lady Death didn't destroy their world. She merely removed the lie that it was ever alive